Welcome into Courtside Seats with Kroeger,
a Charlotte Hornets podcast.
Here he is, Chris Kroeger.
All right, here we are. It's another episode of Courtside Seats, our Charlotte Hornets podcast, and post All-Star break, we got a little R&R. We're rejuvenated and ready for the playoff push, and we're also in the thick of things in the college basketball season because we're about to turn the page to March, which is crazy, and that also means NBA draft season is well around the corner as well. So we figured, why not just marry all these things together and bring in Sam Vecenie, now writing for The Athletic, and we'll just talk a little NBA, a little college hoops, and maybe you can get an early preview of some of these prospects in college basketball, talking a little NBA draft as well. Sam, it's good to talk to you, man. How you doing?
It's good to chat with you, too. I'm doing great. It's just a very, very busy time of year for me, man. We've got March around the corner. We've got NBA heating up because, like Charlotte is in the midst of a playoff race right now, for instance. They're a great example of it. So it's a really great time. It's a really fun time. It's just, between, everything that's going on, my time is, there's just so much going on,
No, there's a lot, and what ends up happening, too, this time of year, especially for, like us, now you're in the playoff race, you're trying to figure out all the mathematical outcomes, and then you're, like, scoreboard watching every night, and it's, like, from game to game, oh, man, we got a great shot, look what happened here, and then look who lost, and then they coming back, and they have a huge win the next night, so it's crazy. You see a team like Orlando have a bad loss, and they come back, and they beat Toronto the next night, so it's a fun time of year, and so we're going to talk about all this, but do me a favor, because I told you, this is my first year just being fully committed to the NBA, and so as a guy that grew up around here in this part of the world, obviously I always cared about college basketball, and especially this time of year. But I'll be honest with you, outside of Duke, Carolina last week, I hadn't watched a full college basketball game in its entirety all year. So what on earth have I been missing all season long? Catch me up. It's a lot.
Well, you've been missing the Duke show.
Yeah.
The Duke show is really fun. They have three of the top, 5, we'll say, prospects in all of college basketball. You've been missing a few really interesting teams like Gonzaga as one of the best offenses in like the Ken Pom database history right now. They have like a 128 offensive rating. It's insane. Let's see, who else do we got? We got Virginia. It just continues to chug right along. They have only lost to Duke. They've lost to Duke twice, but they look absolutely terrific as they always have, and I think they're going to bounce back from losing in the first round to a 16 seed last year. And then, there are a few interesting, older teams. Like, we don't associate Kentucky with being older typically. Mm-hmm. And look, they're not exactly what I would call a veteran team, but P.J. Washington looks really good. Reed Travis is a senior. They actually have a few guys that are upperclassmen that play on this team right now. Texas Tech's really good. Michigan's really good. Tennessee's really good. You can go up and down the lineup and just kind of look at a lot of fun college basketball teams. Now, the NBA draft this year, I think it's not quite as strong as especially what we've seen the last 2 years. I would say it's even a slightly below average draft in comparison to years past, over the last 2 decades or whatever. But overall, it's a fun, weird, wild college basketball season more than anything, I would say.
Okay, and then Carolina, I've been loosely paying attention to see them coming on like every North Carolina team ever does. They're starting to hit their stride late into February and into early March, right? That's starting to become a thing as well.
Yeah, they've won 10 of 11. They've beaten a few really good teams like Duke. You said you watched the game last Wednesday. They beat Virginia Tech. They've beaten Louisville to get some revenge on them for a loss earlier in the season. They played Virginia pretty tight, I thought. I think it was 2 Mondays ago now. So they look really good. They're playing up-tempo. They have 2, maybe 3 even potential first-round picks in Nasir Little, Cam Johnson, and Kobe White. A few older guys like Luke May and Kenny Williams who've been around the system for forever and can really help out, some of those younger talented guys. And, it's a good year for North Carolina basketball. I think that if they can start to get Nasir Little even more integrated into their offense and get a little bit more production out of him, I do think that you're looking at one of the three most talented teams in the country.
Well, and so let's talk about what happened obviously last week with, I mean, just a spectacle what happened with Zion and all the crazy stuff. We'll get into the aftermath of it, but I heard somebody, I think, throwing this out there the other day, and you would know best, I think, on this, but when you talk about like the lightning rod that is Duke basketball right now with that talented group of freshmen you're talking about, I mean, to me, I can't remember a college basketball team, not in my recent memory, that was this transcendent beyond college basketball, because college basketball is still such a niche sport during the regular season before you get to March Madness. But this Duke team has leapt out of all those sort of barriers, and they're a culturally relevant team. And it's the first time you've said that about a college basketball team since who? Is it the Fab Five, or has there been some team in between? Because this team is a culturally relevant team, and a lot of it is Zion, but those other kids too, for how talented they are. But this is a Duke team that just extends beyond just the regular realm of college basketball right now.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with you that they are probably the most culturally relevant team that we've seen since the Fab Five. I would bring up that Kentucky team, like, what was it, maybe 4 years ago, the one with Devin Booker and Karl Towns. They had 8 guys that ended up playing in the NBA, and they were undefeated basically until the Final Four when they lost. And, the conversation was, will this team go undefeated and become the best college basketball team ever? I still think that they might have a case for that, even though they didn't win the tournament. That's
totally
just incredible. But nonetheless, I think that team never quite broke through just in terms of being in the conversation just for people that don't even care about basketball. NBA people would talk about that Kentucky team. They broke through to NBA fans. This Duke team has broken through to general sports fans, which is a totally different ballgame. And in large part, it's because of Zion. Zion is, in my opinion, the best draft prospect that we've seen since Anthony Davis. And on top of that, I think he's the most exciting college basketball player that I've seen ever. He's just unbelievable. Yeah. He does things that we've never seen on a basketball floor before. So it's a fascinating kind of realm that we've entered with this Duke team. And, it's obviously, as you said, in part due to the lightning rod that is Duke basketball, where most of the time people either love them or they hate them, but they certainly have an opinion on them nonetheless.
Zion, I don't know, maybe this is just more of a one-to-one, physical comp, but there's some Shaq stuff there, right? With when you're watching him physically, he's a monster playing with with our other grown men, but they appear to be children compared to literally the physical size of Zion. That's part of this, right? It's how Shaq looked when he was playing at LSU.
To me, it reminds me a lot of that. Yeah, everyone tries to come up with positional comps, right? Like Charles Barkley and Larry Johnson, and people like that. What I would say, though, is I agree with you that Shaq is the most just standout comp in terms of a guy who is just so physically dominant at everything that he does. Mm-hmm. Just breaking through in this way. He is just so much quicker than everyone. He's so much more physically strong than everyone that he plays. He's skilled. It's very similar to Shaq in that he gets underrated for his skill because of the power that he has. He can really handle the ball. He can really go right with his handle, then spin back left. He has great touch around the basket. The only thing he really can't do consistently right now, he doesn't really shoot the ball at a high level, but he's made a lot of strides there over the course of the last year, and I think that'll come at some point. So, yeah, I am a pretty big fan of Zion Williamson. He is just such a fun player to watch, and I'll be really interested to see where this goes here down the stretch. Hopefully he can get healthy, get the knee back to where it was before he blew out his shoe randomly in the middle of a game.
It's amazing, too, and this is why, like you're talking about, they're culturally relevant. It's a lightning rod, but seeing him blow a tire, so to speak, in that Duke Carolina game, and thankfully it was such a minor injury, it appears. But so many people said at the time, "I've never seen anything like it." Well, I mean, I have seen things like it. Maybe not 30 seconds into a game, maybe not a guy of that size, but I've seen guys blow through shoes before. It's not the first time we've had a shoe malfunction in a basketball game, but just all of it, on that stage in that matchup, in that arena with literally President 44, Barack Obama, watching courtside and pointing out he blew through a shoe, like all those things. It's just like it adds to the mythos that is Zion Williamson. And, of course, then literally we can't even let it rest 30 minutes before everybody starts a national dialogue of, okay, well, should this kid ever lace him up and play college basketball anymore? And I don't know. I'm an NBA guy, and even that's exhausting to me. College basketball is worth something in this world. And if the kid wants to play, and clearly he has, let him play. But I don't know. That whole thing was exhausting to me the moment it broke out last week.
So, I come at it from two angles. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that what that conversation does is it somewhat dehumanizes him in a way, because at the end of the day, you're removing his free will. Sometimes it's the way some people talk about it, not everyone, but, Zion Williamson is a kid that has very strong opinions on wanting to play with his teammates. He wants to get back and really help them out. You watch him over the weekend in Syracuse. He was the first guy up off the bench. He was the best cheerleader on the team. He loved being a part of the team, it seems like. And, this is not the first time that this conversation has arisen this year, because, it came up in December once he established himself as the very clear number one overall pick. It came up in January once he crystallized that he was the number one overall pick very clearly. So, it's just been a constant dialogue. It came to a head when his shoe blares out, or whatever you want to call it, on Wednesday, and it became exhausting to me as well. But I also think that we do need to continue to have these dialogues about college basketball and about the just the impact that certain athletes, such as a Zion Williamson, such as a Kyler Murray at Oklahoma, such as even an R.J. Barrett, even someone like Bruno Fernando at Maryland, like these guys are providing value above and beyond what their scholarship is. And I think that the more we can do to further the discussion of potentially paying athletes either via, and really likely via, name and likenesses getting paid, brands paying for athletes' name and likenesses, giving them money. I think that the more we further that discussion, it's better. But I just hope that we can do it in a way that humanizes the free will that Zion has.
I know you should probably stand with me on this. Like Mike DeCourcy, who is, the Hall of Famer for Sporting News, always comes up on the one and done. And it's funny because he's such like a stalwart of college basketball that I think a lot of people think, oh, he must hate one and dones. But he actually is on the side of, hey, one and done is good for college basketball too. Now, would we prefer guys stay for longer periods of time? Of course. I don't think anybody's arguing otherwise. But let's not act like college basketball isn't benefiting from Zion Williamson even being there for a year or a half a year, or any of these players, for instance. So, like this idea of just throwing away the one and done rule, I think we all agree there's got to be some sort of balance here, but let's not act like it's also hampering college basketball totally, because there's some benefit here. So the whole conversation is so, intertwined, all of these different elements that are involved. But I feel like, to your point, everything becomes so binary, and it's either we do this or we don't do it. It's either good for the kid or it's bad for the kid. But, there are a lot of shades of gray in all these conversations around college basketball and the NBA and the early entry rule and all that stuff right now.
Yeah, no question. And I think that there are differing views in the NBA, even, of how the one and done going away will affect things. Like, look, I think that front office executives kind of prefer the one and done. They want to make sure that they don't screw up by getting another year to evaluate kids, right? Like, it helps them evaluate kids in competitive atmospheres. Sometimes these, college coaches, we're not going to sit here and say that college coaches are, necessarily quite at the level X's and O's wise in a lot of cases that NBA coaches are, but it gives them a chance to see how they thrive in a competitive atmosphere. It gives them a chance to see exactly how their defense translates. What are their instincts on the basketball floor? Can they find a way to make an impact if it's a bad situation? Can they find a way to make an impact if it's a good situation? There's just a lot going on that I think often doesn't get brought up within these conversations. And I think that the more color, the more shade that we can provide to it, it is a valuable conversation, but it has to be done right.
There's got to be overhaul of some sort, right, in this whole system, and I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe it's this FBI probe. I know a couple of coaches were subpoenaed, right, the other day, so Eventually, they're going to have to take the witness stand. But I was talking to Bismack Biyombo, who just got voted as a vice president for the NBPA, and he was saying during their meeting, they were talking about the one and done rule, and obviously it's been reported that the Players Association, it'll ultimately come to their table whether they're going to approve removing the one and done rule and bring the early entry rule back to the NBA draft. And he was saying, look, even as players, we were debating the merits, plus and minus of removing this rule and all the things that can come of it. So it's just interesting. Him and I were having this conversation, and Biz, obviously being from the DRC, he comes from an international, experience of how he matured and Nike Hoop Summit and what that did to introduce him to the basketball world and all that stuff. And him and I were having the discussion, Sam, of, could you bring the academy style? I know a lot of people have talked about this, but the academy system that exists overseas, could you find a way to bring that to the U.S.? And I think it's a great idea, but executing it's a whole other issue. I don't even know where you'd even start to do something like that.
Yeah, I think that the NBA is interested in an avenue like that. I think that you can look at the fact that they're starting this African basketball league, right? You can look at the fact that they are, they're starting academies in China and in Latin America and in Africa. I personally am someone who believes, I would love to see that. I think it would give kids a little bit more optionality. It would give, as long as we can find a way to pay them what they're worth, because ultimately that's what this comes down to, right? We have to find a better way to give kids what they're worth. I really do think that would be the best way to go about it, finding a way to do this academy system, finding a way to, maybe get kids in with NBA teams from a younger age and allow them to, just kind of matriculate through and get in front of NBA players from an earlier age and get in front of great coaching from an earlier age. If we can evaluate and identify these elite players pretty early, which, we've gotten better at. I don't know that we're quite there yet in terms of getting them all and figuring out which players are going to be great. Guys like Jimmy Butler, who end up going to JUCO and then Marquette and then, late first-round pick and become one of the top 10 players in the league. These guys happen. But I do think that it would help if we could get more of these guys in front of elite-level coaching and elite-level players because, I think that you can look at European guys, they come over into the league, and I think that they are incredibly skilled. Sometimes the athleticism doesn't necessarily allow for the translation of their skills to the NBA, but I do think that their skill levels are incredibly high, and the more that we could look at trying to replicate that, it would really help.
Yeah, and I think the maturity aspect of it too, which goes without saying, because you're learning, you're forced into it. You have no choice. You're playing. Some of these kids are teenagers at that time. You're playing with grown men. Arnoldus Kubolka, who the Hornets we drafted in the second round this year and took a bit of a flyer on, I suppose, and a draft and stash guy. And I was talking to Arnie during the summer league in Vegas, and he was like, I've been doing this since I was 13, 14 years old, and these are guys fighting to put food on their plates for their family, and here I am as a teenager. So that's like a fight or flight instinct. You're either up for that, going up against grown men, and that's going to make you a better player, and we've seen it with Luka, I think, obviously, or it's not, but you're going to get chewed up and spit out. But that only exists in that ecosystem overseas because of that, because those guys are playing at such a young age with guys who are either more advanced in age or talent or whatever. So there's something to be said for that with a lot of international players, the maturity and the professionalism they bring over here.
Yeah, no question. I think that's definitely true. Kubolka, I am very interested to see what happens with his career. He's someone that I really liked from a young age, and then he grew from being 6'8" to 6'10" whenever he was, I want to say 19, and his frame is still catching up a little bit, I think, in terms of that. So he's a real interesting one. I liked that pick a lot, actually.
You've written for all sorts of sites, CBS, you've worked for CBS, and now you're with The Athletic. You got your podcast, the Game Theory podcast, but you're doing NBA coverage, college basketball coverage, NBA draft coverage. You're marrying all those things together, and you've got a really cool piece, which is up now at The Athletic, where you've talked to just dozens upon dozens of college basketball assistants off the record. You granted them anonymity, so they would give some pretty honest and candid responses on a load of these draft prospects. And it's just different. You're doing different work that I guess it maybe only is really possible through a site like The Athletic right now in terms of how you're covering college hoops in the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm incredibly lucky to be at The Athletic. I think it's very rare in this ecosystem that you can go for 2 weeks only writing like 2 stories, right? And the reason that I did that is because they believed in this project that I was working through. And, at the end of the day, I have like 15 stories coming this week, so it all evens out. But, I think that a lot of places just don't have the ability to look at things from such a wide angle view, from such a long lens. And The Athletic, because of their model, because of the subscription model, because of just the way that they look at things and what they think readers care about, they do a really great job of letting me focus on these longer term things where they let me call 50 assistant coaches around the country and get some evaluations on guys. So it's a really great place to work. I think that the company itself is just fantastic.
Yeah, and I think too, so we've got Rod Boone here, who's on the Hornets beat this year for The Athletic, and I'm an Athletic subscriber because it's a no-brainer. It pays for itself, especially in my line of work. But I just think it's interesting to see the network of people, and it grows day by day, not only across nationally but locally. And now you've got this interconnected web of national writers and then local writers on the beat, and I think it's something that maybe every, ESPN has tried to do maybe, but they started national and then tried to go down to the local level, where it's almost worked opposite with The Athletic, it seems, where you guys started at the local level, started cobbling up and gobbling up all these local writers who, for a lot of them, been doing it for decades, covering their local beats and all these respective sports, and then you've grown nationally off of that. So I think it's, to my outside eyes, seems like you guys have done it the right way, and it's provided a really unique platform that I don't think any other media company has right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was a really smart way to go about building it. I think that their biggest thing was they wanted to focus on underserved markets when they started. And, that's how they started with national NHL coverage. And obviously they have the local market coverage, which is fantastic. And, I think that there just isn't a great platform right now, a lot of times, for local coverage to go as deep as it does, because the newspaper model is what it is. You have to have something every day. So I do think that they have gone about building it the right way, and I have a lot of faith in them.
All right, let's talk a little Hornets here. We've got James Borrego in here as a first-year head coach. Mitch Kupchak now is the general manager. It's their first season together, and I just think, nothing else withstanding, when you're able to get a GM handpick his coach and start with a clean slate of things, I think that's always a good starting point. Would you agree? And so I think, everything moving forward is how you got to judge this Hornets team starting this season and moving forward with Mitch Kupchak and James Borrego as a pair, because now they're married together and they're linked together with how they're going to run this team.
Yeah, I think that's the smart move. I do. I believe in that being the right way to go about things, making sure that, your coach and your GM are aligned in terms of vision. I think that, a great example of this that ended up, I think working out well was Brett Brown and Sam Hinkie, even as Brett Brown, went through years and years of losing, Sam Hinkie trusted him, and then Sam Hinkie obviously departs under circumstances that were less than ideal, I would say. But I do believe that nonetheless, it kind of shows in the way that if you have aligned ideals, if you have aligned personalities in charge, it helps you build a culture. It helps you build toward something, toward an ideal of what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. And I think that it was smart. And, James Borrego obviously has an incredible reputation from being around Greg Popovich for many years. And I think that he's done a pretty good job there so far this year. Now we'll see how they close out. They still have the issues in tight games that have plagued them seemingly for the last 3 years. And I don't really know what to attribute that to be honest. But nonetheless, I think that he has done a good enough job here to make me think that they made the right call.
You know what's interesting too is you look at and I get to see it every day. Like he's got a real finger on the pulse of X's and O's and what the actions that this team can run and execute and really execute at a pretty high level. And some of the action is just really simple, and we've been doing a lot of it all year. And yet it's just our bread and butter. We go to it, especially out of bounds and baseline out of bounds. We have these actions that are just. They're simple and they just work. And when they run, they just run to perfection every time. And I've been amazed at his work schematically. And I think he's got a real bright mind when it comes to offense, because this is the crazy thing. You don't often see this where the personnel's largely the same, but you see a big jump. And the Hornets have taken a pretty big leap in terms of some off. Now, it's backslid a little bit here, but through the first half of the year, Hornets were one of the most efficient offenses in the NBA. And through the first couple months of the year, we saw what Kemba was doing. The Hornets were one of the top 5 to 10 offenses in the NBA. And I think that's a testament not only to the players, but what James Borrego's put in here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of it early on was Borrego. Now, I think that opposing coaches have adjusted a little bit to what Charlotte is doing. I additionally believe that some of the players on the roster have reverted back a little bit more to what their true skill level is, and that is probably a little bit frustrating for Charlotte Hornets fans to watch. I think that once the Hornets can maybe reshape the roster in the image of what Mitch Kupchak wants to do, that will certainly help them a little bit more than where they are now. They just have so many long-term contracts tied up to where it's really, really difficult, I think, for them to make a full-on make a full-on impact in terms of rebuilding the roster the way they want to. But, maybe next year that is something that could happen.
Yeah, and to that point, so let's go back to the trade deadline. Obviously, there were reports we were active and trying to make deals done near the trade deadline. I think every team's trying to do something in some capacity. So I believe we were the only team to not make a trade in the East at the trade deadline. And I don't know, maybe a zig when everybody else zags a little bit. But I personally, and this is with no inside info or anything, I just personally believe that if the team had to give up young players or future draft assets to make a deal in the short term, that's a very it's a precarious spot to be in. And from that respect, I actually appreciated that Mitch Kupchak said, you know what, and he's been very vocal about this from day one on the record, every press conference and conference call he's ever done. Hey, look, this is going to take time, and there's no quick fix, there's no easy fix, and if you're looking for that, those are often the things that get you in trouble. So I actually appreciated that maybe we stood pat at the trade deadline and said, look, this is going to have to get turned around over time, and we want to be a consistent winner, and consistency happens in a longer time frame. And so I kind of appreciated that for the Hornets.
Yeah, I think that a big part of it that is tough is just like the uncertainty over what Kemba Walker is going to do, because to try and keep Kemba Walker, you can't necessarily go into a full-scale rebuild, right? But you're also in a circumstance where you don't want to give up long-term assets because you don't know if Kemba Walker is staying. So I don't want to necessarily, it's not like, they're being held hostage by Kemba Walker. It's, in many cases a good problem to have that they have a star player that has been as open as he is about, potentially being willing to stay. Now he'll test the free agency market and we'll see where it goes. But, it's a good problem to have that Kemba Walker is still considering staying in Charlotte long term. But it does create a circumstance where it becomes a little bit more difficult to create a plan both in the short term and the long term, because, your priorities are somewhat split,
Yeah, no doubt. And I think when you look at where this team is, Malik Monk now in his second year. Malik just turned 21, still a really young player. I think we've seen stretches this year where Malik is really starting to get and feel more comfortable with the NBA game. That hasn't happened overnight. It also hasn't just happened consistently and stayed that way, and that's the struggle with young players in the NBA. It's not going to happen on the time frame you want it to happen on. And then you've got Miles Bridges and Devontae Graham out there as well. Dwayne Bacon, a second-year pick from a couple of years ago, who's with this group as well. So I'll go back to going into this draft this past year, before the Hornets actually selected Miles and Devontae and Arnoldus Kubolka. What did you think of their draft prospects? And then now looking back after the fact, how do you think the draft has fared, at least early, basically a year in so far?
So yeah, I was very high on Miles. Miles was one of my favorite lottery picks in comparison to consensus, right? I think most people had Miles as like a mid-teens guy, somewhere in the, maybe 12 to 17 range in there. I had him at number 8. I believed in his athleticism translating immediately. I believed in his just strength on the court, being able to take impact and being able to play through contact is something that I think a lot of young players struggle with a little bit. I think he's a smart defensive player. I think that he's a very high IQ offensive player in terms of passing the ball. His jump shot, I think, still has a little bit of a ways to go, but I think at some point he will end up being a pretty good jump shooter. Overall, though, I'm a fan of Miles Bridges and have been since he was in college. Devontae Graham, I was probably right in line with consensus. I had him in the 40s on my board. He's a good backup point guard long term. That's kind of where I see his role. I don't really see much more than that, to be honest. I don't really know that I see the athletic explosiveness to be able to consistently break down defenses, but as a guy who can come in, he can make shots, he can distribute, he plays pretty hard on defense as well. I think that he's a really nice change of pace guard for the Hornets to continue to build around long term as a backup, and they have him on a nice little contract for a while now. And then finally, Arnoldas Kulboka, like you said, or like we talked about a little bit earlier, I really liked him when he was younger. I liked him so much that I think I had him as like a potential first-round pick going into the what draft did he enter, 2018? So out of 2017, I had him as a potential first-round pick going into that draft. And then he hits this growth spurt to where he goes from being like 6'8" up to 6'10", and it kind of elongates his body, and he kind of struggled a little bit through those 2 years, at least for the first year, trying to figure out exactly how to use his frame in the best way. He struggled. He was better in his second year, in his draft year, but I'll be interested to see how he continues to grow. I think he's playing for Bamberg in the Champions League right now, averaging like 6 points, kind of starting some games here, starting some games there. But the shooting is the big thing with him. He's obviously a knockdown shooter. I believe I had him right around 50 on my draft board, so it was a totally reasonable pick, totally reasonable stash for the Hornets to have overseas. And if the body ever comes along in the way that the jump shot and the skill has come along, I do think he has a chance of coming over. It's just it's going to take a couple of years, I think, for the body to catch up.
Yeah, and last thing on that too, I'll say this: like this is where I really, I'm around Mitch more often, and not that I'm aware of like everything going on in the microscopic level, but just like generally his leadership, his organization, the way he views every avenue to try to improve the team. Even a situation like that, basically a draft and stash player in Arnoldas Kulboka. Those are the types of picks, if you want to view them as lottery tickets, you got to buy the lottery ticket if you want to have a chance to win the lottery. And using those avenues that, again, aren't going to pay off in the short term, but in the long term, those are what you have to do if you want to be a really good, consistent team. And we haven't done that in the past. And I love the fact that the Hornets did that this year. He acquired a lot of second-round picks, too, which, you got to have those. You can't just sell away second-round picks. And I think the Hornets now, moving forward, those are the small moves that maybe aren't the sexiest thing in the world, but I think Mitch Kupchak realizes there's a lot of value there. And I think you go back and look at D'Angelo Russell this year. Look at all the draft picks Mitch has had, whether they're high lottery, late lottery, or late first-round, early second-round picks. Mitch Kupchak's got a pretty good draft resume over the years with his time in L.A., and that's probably an encouragement for Hornets fans moving forward.
Yeah, I think he absolutely does, and I think that you hit the nail on the head with second-round picks. Not only do you want to have a lot of second-round picks because they are cheap sources of potential value, and they're all essentially lottery tickets. But, in the case of stashing someone, I think that it's valuable to stash players overseas. Like the Hornets were not going to go into this year having 3 rookies on like legit contracts, right? And the way that the NBA is going, basically all top 50 players that are selected get guaranteed contracts now. So I think it was pretty smart to end up stashing a player overseas using their 2 two-way contracts on guys like J.P. McCura and Joe Cheeley. And, if you need someone to step up, you can have those guys get called up, and you can have an asset overseas that is growing and maturing while it's not on your dime necessarily.
That's episode 35 of Courtside Seats, our Charlotte Hornets podcast. Sam Vecenie of The Athletic making time for us. Covered all the bases there. Talked a little NBA draft, little college hoops, and even some talk about what is going on with the Hornets and across the NBA right now. So give Sam a follow on Twitter at Sam_Vecenie, and you can check out his work at theathletic.com, including that NBA draft profile that's up there right now. If you've missed any of our previous episodes of Courtside Seats, you can check them out at Hornets.com on our Hornets mobile app. You can also find them on YouTube on our official Charlotte Hornets YouTube channel. Just search Courtside Seats. Or you could find us anywhere else podcasts are available, Stitcher, Spotify, and including Apple Podcasts. So just search us. You can find us there. Subscribe, rate, and review, and check out all the previous episodes. We'll catch you guys again next week back here, another edition of Courtside Seats.